March 18, 1950, 11:23 p.m. The emergency entrance of Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center on West 168th Street in Washington Heights, a massive complex of interconnected buildings constructed in the late 1920s that represented one of the most advanced medical facilities in the world, with state-of-the-art operating rooms and research laboratories, and specialized departments that attracted physicians from across the country who wanted to work at the forefront of modern medicine and treat patients, using the latest techniques and technologies that distinguished Columbia Presbyterian from smaller, less sophisticated hospitals that lacked the resources and expertise concentrated in this extraordinary institution that served primarily Manhattan's affluent white residents who could afford private physicians and expensive treatments that poor people could never access, regardless of how desperately they needed medical intervention to survive illnesses or injuries that would be treatable with proper care, but that became fatal when care was delayed or denied for reasons having nothing to do with medical necessity and everything to do with racial policies that prioritized white lives over black lives in ways that were rarely acknowledged publicly, but that everyone understood as fundamental reality of American healthcare in 1950. Sarah Williams stood in the brightly lit emergency waiting room holding her 7-year-old son, Marcus, in her arms, the child's small body burning with fever that had reached 104 degrees Fahrenheit approximately 2 hours earlier, when Sarah had finally acknowledged that home remedies were insufficient for whatever illness had been progressively worsening over the past 3 days, transforming Marcus from an energetic boy who loved playing stickball in the streets of Harlem into a limp, barely conscious child whose breathing had become increasingly labored and whose skin had taken on a grayish pallor that terrified his mother in ways that transcended normal parental worry and entered the realm of genuine dread that her only child might be dying. Sarah was 34 years old, a widow whose husband had died in a construction accident 4 years earlier, a domestic worker who cleaned apartments for white families in the Upper East Side, and who earned approximately $18 weekly from work that required her to leave Harlem at 6 in the morning and return after 8 at night, 6 days per week, leaving Marcus in the care of her elderly mother during those long hours when Sarah scrubbed floors and washed dishes and dusted furniture for people whose monthly rent exceeded Sarah's annual income. When the hospital's intake nurse, middle-aged white woman named Patricia Donnelly, who had worked at Columbia Presbyterian for 16 years, finally approached Sarah after making her wait approximately 28 minutes while other patients, who had arrived later, were processed ahead of her. The nurse's expression immediately communicated something beyond normal bureaucratic impatience or professional fatigue, revealing instead a kind of cold certainty that this interaction would not proceed according to the desperate mother's hopes or expectations. Nurse Donnelly did not ask about Marcus's symptoms, or inquire about how long he had been ill, or request any of the standard medical history information that would typically precede emergency admission for a child presenting with obvious signs of serious illness, requiring immediate evaluation and treatment. Instead, she spoke in a tone that combined rehearsed politeness with unmistakable finality. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to take your son to Harlem Hospital. Columbia Presbyterian has a policy regarding patient admissions, and your son would be better served at the facility in your own community where doctors are accustomed to treating people from your neighborhood. Harlem Hospital is located at 506 Lenox Avenue, approximately 3 miles north of here. I'm sure they'll be able to help you there." The explanation was delivered smoothly, with the practiced ease of someone who had given similar instructions many times before. Someone who understood that the actual reason for this referral could not be stated explicitly, but who also knew that both parties understood perfectly well why a black child was being turned away from a white hospital. If you've ever been denied something essential because of who you are rather than any legitimate reason, if you've watched someone you love suffer while institutions designed to help instead turn you away with polite explanations that barely conceal ugly truths, leave a comment about how that moment changed your understanding of the world you're living in. And subscribe to this channel, because what you're about to witness is how Bumpy Johnson responded when he discovered that a hospital built with public money, operating under a charter requiring service to all New Yorkers, had just sentenced a 7-year-old child to potential death for the crime of being born black. Sarah's voice shook as she attempted to explain the urgency of Marcus's condition, the fact that she had already considered going to Harlem Hospital but had been told by her neighbor, a nurse aide who worked there, that The emergency room was experiencing severe overcrowding due to a flu epidemic that had filled every available bed and created waiting times exceeding 6 hours for non-critical patients, and that while Marcus's condition was undeniably serious, it might not be classified as immediately life-threatening by triage nurses dealing with gunshot victims and heart attack patients and other emergencies that demanded instant attention. But Nurse Donnelly's expression remained unchanged throughout Sarah's desperate explanation, communicating through practiced indifference that these concerns were irrelevant to the hospital's policy regarding patient admissions. "Ma'am, I understand your concerns, but Columbia Presbyterian simply cannot accommodate your son tonight. Harlem Hospital is an excellent institution with capable physicians. I'm going to have to ask you to leave now." When Sarah attempted to press her case again, Nurse Donnelly threatened to call police to remove her for trespassing and disturbing the peace. Sarah turned toward the exit, tears streaming down her face, holding Marcus close and whispering prayers that God would somehow preserve her son's life long enough to reach Harlem Hospital and receive treatment before pneumonia. She had finally remembered that her own father had died from pneumonia when she was 12 years old, displaying symptoms eerily similar to what Marcus was experiencing. Now destroyed his lungs and stopped his breathing permanently. But as Sarah pushed through the heavy glass doors leading out of the emergency entrance into the cold March night, where rain had begun falling in a steady drizzle, she nearly collided with a tall, powerfully built black man in an expensive dark suit who was entering the building accompanied by two other well-dressed men whose barren and watchful expressions suggested they served as bodyguards or enforcers for someone important. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was 45 years old in March 1950, at the absolute peak of his power and influence in Harlem's criminal underworld. Someone who controlled much of the neighborhood's gambling operations and who had survived gang wars and prison sentences and assassination attempts to emerge as one of the most formidable and respected black crime bosses in New York City. Bumpy's presence at Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center at 11:30 on a Saturday night was not coincidental, but rather the result of a phone call he had received approximately 40 minutes earlier from one of his runners who lived in the apartment building adjacent to Sarah Williams, and who had heard Sarah's conversations with neighbors about Marcus's worsening condition and the impossible choice between waiting hours at Harlem Hospital or attempting to seek treatment at one of the bed-equipped white hospitals nearby that might provide faster, more effective care, but that also might refuse service based on racial policies that everyone knew existed, even though they were rarely discussed openly or challenged directly. Bumpy stopped Sarah as she attempted to move past him into the night, his hand gentle on her shoulder, but firm enough to pause her momentum. "Mrs. Williams, my name is Ellsworth Johnson. Your neighbor Eddie called me about your situation with your son, Marcus. I understand the hospital just refused to admit him. Is that correct?" Sarah nodded, unable to speak through tears and exhaustion and fear. Bumpy looked down at Marcus, assessing the child's condition with quick diagnostic eye. And what he saw in Marcus's labored breathing and grayish complexion and complete lack of responsiveness convinced him that this child was genuinely dying and would likely not survive the journey to Harlem Hospital, followed by 6 hours waiting for treatment. "Mrs. Williams, I need you to come back inside with me. Your son is going to be admitted to Columbia Presbyterian tonight, and he's going to receive the best treatment this hospital can provide, and it's going to happen in the next 10 minutes, regardless of what policies the staff believes govern their admissions procedures. Do you understand?" Bumpy entered the emergency waiting room with Sarah following close behind, Marcus still unconscious in her arms, and approached the intake desk, where Nurse Donnelly was processing paperwork for a white patient who had arrived approximately 5 minutes earlier. Nurse Donnelly looked up with an expression of irritation that transformed quickly into concern when she recognized that the black woman she had just expelled was now returning accompanied by men whose expensive clothing and confident bearing suggested they were not typical Harlem residents who could be intimidated through threats of police involvement. "Nurse Donnelly, I believe there's been a misunderstanding about this child's admission status. Marcus Williams is going to be evaluated immediately by your best pediatric physician, and he is going to be admitted to the pediatric ward for treatment of what appears to be severe bacterial pneumonia, requiring immediate antibiotic intervention and respiratory support. I'm not asking you to make this happen. I'm informing you that it will happen, starting right now." and I strongly recommend that you proceed with standard emergency admission protocols rather than forcing me to explain to hospital administrators why their institution's racist policies nearly resulted in a child's preventable death tonight. Nurse Donnelly, before you call security, I think you should understand something about how Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center actually operates. Your hospital receives daily deliveries of linens from Apex Laundry Services on Amsterdam Avenue. All of your bed sheets, surgical gowns, patient blankets, and towels are cleaned and delivered by Apex, which is owned by my associate Marcus Freeman. Your hospital receives daily deliveries of food supplies from Metropolitan Wholesale Foods in the Bronx, including all the meat, produce, dairy products, and dry goods that feed your patients and staff. Metropolitan is controlled by my associate James Chun. Your hospital receives medical supplies, including bandages, surgical instruments, and pharmaceuticals from 4 different suppliers, 3 of which operate under contracts that I negotiated personally and 1 of which is owned by my cousin Raymond Johnson. Your hospital's waste disposal is handled by Riverside Sanitation Company, which is owned by my associate William Thompson. Your hospital employs approximately 60 maintenance workers, custodians, and groundskeepers who are all members of Local 237 of the Building Service Workers Union, which is led by my associate Daniel Murphy, who consults with me on all major decisions affecting the union's relationship with institutional employers in Manhattan. At precisely this moment, everyone in the emergency waiting room who had been pretending not to listen to the confrontation unfolding at the intake desk suddenly became completely silent, creating an atmosphere of suspended tension as people processed the extraordinary revelation that Bumpy Johnson's influence extended far beyond Harlem's streets and gambling operations into the basic infrastructure of institutions that assumed their operations were independent of black criminal networks. Have you ever discovered that someone you dismissed as powerless actually controlled everything you depended on to function? That your assumptions about who held real power were completely backwards? Leave a comment about the moment you realized the quiet person in the corner was actually running the entire operation. And subscribe now, because the next few seconds will show you exactly how Bumpy Johnson transformed decades of strategic economic positioning into leverage that hospital administrators never imagined a black gangster could possess over their prestigious medical institution. Bumpy continued speaking while Nurse Donnelly's face progressively lost color. Now, I'm not threatening to disrupt any of these services tonight. All of your suppliers will continue delivering on schedule. All of your union workers will continue performing their jobs professionally. All of your contracts will remain in effect exactly as currently structured. But I need you to understand something very clearly. Every one of these relationships exists because I allow them to exist, because I've chosen to facilitate smooth operations rather than create problems. And my willingness to maintain these cooperative arrangements depends entirely on Columbia Presbyterian demonstrating that it understands who actually controls essential aspects of its operations, and what consequences would follow from treating my community members with the kind of racist contempt you just showed Mrs. Williams when she brought her dying son here seeking emergency medical care. Nurse Donnelly whispered in a voice barely audible, I don't have authority to change hospital admission policies. That kind of decision needs to come from administrators or medical staff. Even if what you're saying is accurate about these business relationships, I can't just admit a colored patient to the pediatric ward without authorization. Bumpy closed his notebook, returned it to his jacket pocket, and spoke with reasonable tone. Nurse Donnelly, here's what's going to happen in the next 5 minutes. You're going to page Dr. Harrison Thornton, your chief of pediatrics, and inform him that a child with severe respiratory distress requires immediate evaluation in examination room 3. You going to process Marcus Williams' emergency admission paperwork exactly as you would for any white child presenting with similar symptoms. And you're going to do all of this without mentioning my presence here tonight, because the simple truth is that this hospital's policies regarding racial admissions are morally indefensible and probably legally questionable and certainly inconsistent with the medical ethics that supposedly govern physician behavior regardless of patient's race. All I'm doing is giving you permission to do what you should have done immediately when Mrs. Williams arrived, which is treating this as a medical emergency requiring professional response. Dr. Harrison Thornton arrived in the emergency department 11 minutes after being paged. A 53-year-old pediatrician with 30 years of medical experience, including significant work in diseases and respiratory conditions affecting children. When Thornton entered examination room 3 and saw Marcus Williams lying on the table with Sarah standing beside him, while a nurse recorded vital signs that clearly indicated serious respiratory distress, his professional instincts immediately overrode any concerns about racial dynamics. Thornton listened to Marcus's breathing through his stethoscope, examined the child's throat and ears, palpated his lymph nodes, checked his reflexes, and reviewed the temperature and oxygen saturation readings, completing a thorough physical examination that took approximately 8 minutes. And that confirmed what Sarah had feared. This child had severe bacterial pneumonia that had progressed to the point where his lungs were filling with fluid and his oxygen levels were dropping dangerously low, and his body was beginning to fail in ways that would become irreversible within hours, if not addressed through aggressive treatment. This child needs to be admitted immediately to the pediatric intensive care ward. He has bilateral lobar pneumonia with significant pleural effusion. His oxygen saturation is 82%, which is dangerously low. His temperature is 104.3, and his respiratory rate is 40 breaths per minute. He needs intravenous penicillin, started within the next 30 minutes. Oxygen therapy to maintain saturation above 90%. Chest X-rays to determine exact extent of lung involvement, and continuous monitoring of vital signs. Nurse Henderson, please prepare admission paperwork for the pediatric ICU and contact respiratory therapy. I'll write the orders for antibiotics and imaging, and I want laboratory work including complete blood count, blood cultures, and metabolic panel. Thornton's orders were delivered rapidly, with decisive authority that comes from someone who has treated hundreds of similar cases and who understands exactly what needs to happen to maximize chances of positive outcome. After Dr. Thornton left to write admission orders and arrange for Marcus's transfer to the pediatric intensive care unit, Sarah began crying again, but this time from relief rather than despair, from overwhelming gratitude that her son was finally receiving the expert medical attention that might save his life. Bumpy had remained in the examination room throughout Dr. Thornton's evaluation, standing quietly against the wall. And now, as Sarah's tears flowed freely while she stroked Marcus's fevered forehead and whispered thanks to God and to Bumpy, he approached her and spoke quietly. "Mrs. Williams, your son is going to recover. Dr. Thornton is one of the best pediatricians in New York City, and the pediatric intensive care unit here has equipment and staff that can handle the most complicated cases. Marcus will probably be here for 7 to 10 days while the antibiotics clears infection and his lungs heal. But he's going to survive this and go home healthy. The hospital will bill you for his care, but you don't need to worry about paying that bill. I'll handle whatever costs his treatment generates. Your only responsibility is being here with your son as much as possible while he recovers." If you're feeling what Sarah felt in this moment, the absolute shock of watching someone transform impossible situations into resolved outcomes through sheer force of strategic power that nobody saw coming, then you need to hit that like button and subscribe right now, because what happens next is Bumpy Johnson's final warning to hospital administrators. A warning that will change how Columbia Presbyterian treats black patients for the next decade, and that will establish precedents about economic leverage as civil rights enforcement tool years before the 1964 Civil Rights Act and Medicare desegregation efforts that historians credit with ending hospital segregation, showing once again that Bumpy Johnson was always 10 years ahead of official history. But Bumpy had not come to Columbia Presbyterian merely to save one child's life. He had come to establish a new understanding about how this hospital would operate going forward, regarding admission policies for black patients seeking emergency care. After ensuring that Marcus was settled in the pediatric intensive care unit with Sarah beside his bed, and with nursing staff beginning the antibiotic treatment and oxygen therapy, Bumpy requested a meeting with whoever held administrative authority over Columbia Presbyterian's emergency department operations and patient admission policies. The meeting occurred at 1:15 in the morning in an office belonging to Dr. Charles Montgomery, the hospital's director of emergency services, a 48-year-old physician who had transitioned from clinical practice to hospital administration approximately 8 years earlier. Montgomery had been called at home by the overnight emergency department supervisor and informed that a situation was developing that required immediate administrative attention, involving a black patient who had been initially refused admission, but who was now receiving treatment in the pediatric ICU following intervention by someone claiming to control various hospital suppliers and service providers. When Bumpy entered Montgomery's office, accompanied by his two associates, the hospital administrator's body language immediately revealed his discomfort with this situation and his uncertainty about how to proceed. Montgomery gestured toward chairs facing his desk, waited for everyone to sit, and then spoke in carefully neutral tone. "Mr. Johnson, I understand there was an incident in our emergency department earlier tonight. I'd like to understand exactly what occurred and what expectations you have regarding how this situation should be resolved going forward." Bumpy responded with quiet intensity. "Dr. Montgomery, what happened tonight is very simple. Sarah Williams brought her 7-year-old son to your emergency department because he was dying from pneumonia. Your intake nurse refused to admit Marcus Williams based on Columbia Presbyterian's unwritten policy of denying service to black patients regardless of medical urgency. I intervened by explaining that this hospital's operations depend on business relationships that I control or significantly influence, and that continuing to enforce racist admission policies would create operational difficulties. Dr. Thornton then evaluated Marcus, correctly diagnosed severe bacterial pneumonia, and admitted him to your pediatric ICU. What needs to happen going forward is that Columbia Presbyterian needs to establish and enforce a new policy stating that any patient presenting with genuine medical emergency will be evaluated and treated regardless of race." Montgomery listened without interruption, his expression revealing careful calculation as he weighed competing priorities. When Bumpy finished speaking, Montgomery remained silent for approximately 20 seconds, then spoke with careful deliberation. "Mr. Johnson, I want to be clear about several things. First, Columbia Presbyterian has never had an official policy requiring refusal of emergency care to patients based on race. What you witnessed tonight was an individual nurse's interpretation of informal practices. Second, I personally find the denial of emergency care to any child with life-threatening condition to be medically and ethically unacceptable. Third, I recognize that the relationships you described are real, and that disruption would create significant operational challenges. And fourth, I believe it is possible to establish a policy that serves both your community's needs for emergency medical access and this hospital's operational stability." Montgomery outlined his proposal. "Effective immediately, Columbia Presbyterian's emergency department will adopt a formal policy stating that any patient presenting with genuine medical emergency, defined as condition requiring immediate evaluation and treatment to prevent death or serious permanent injury, will be evaluated by qualified physician regardless of patient's race, economic status, or place of residence. This means that if a black child or adult arrives with symptoms suggesting heart attack, severe trauma, acute surgical condition, respiratory distress, or any other life-threatening situation, our staff will provide the same immediate care they would provide to white patients. For non-emergency situations, we will continue to coordinate with Harlem, hospital, and other community facilities." Does this address your concerns? Bumpy considered the proposal, recognizing that it represented genuine compromise. "Dr. Montgomery, your proposed policy is acceptable with one modification. The definition of genuine medical emergency needs to be applied by trained medical professionals using clinical judgment rather than by intake nurses using assumptions about race to determine which patients deserve evaluation. Tonight, Nurse Donnelly refused to even ask about Marcus Williams' symptoms before directing his mother to leave. Every patient who comes to this emergency department needs to be evaluated by someone with medical training before any determination is made about whether they can be referred elsewhere. Can you ensure that happens?" Montgomery nodded. "I can and will ensure that happens. Starting tomorrow, I will distribute written guidelines to all emergency department staff, stating that intake assessment must include basic vital signs and symptom evaluation before any determination about admission or referral. Nurses will be instructed that racial discrimination is prohibited, and violations will result in disciplinary action up to termination. Physicians will be reminded that ethical obligations require providing care based on medical need, and I will personally review emergency department admissions data monthly to identify any patterns suggesting that black patients continue to be referred away at higher rates than medically justified. Does that address your concerns? Bumpy responded. Yes, Dr. Montgomery. I appreciate your willingness to change hospital policy. I'm not looking for ongoing involvement in Columbia Presbyterian's operations. What I want is simple. I want my community members to receive emergency medical care when they need it, without being turned away because of racist assumptions. If your new policy accomplishes that goal, then all the business relationships I mentioned tonight will continue functioning smoothly. If your staff continues discriminating despite the policy change, then we'll need to have another conversation about consequences. Do we understand each other? The story of Marcus Williams' admission to Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center and Bumpy Johnson's late-night confrontation with hospital administrators about racial discrimination in emergency care became well known throughout Harlem within days, spreading through churches and barbershops and social clubs as example of how one man's strategic positioning and willingness to leverage economic power could accomplish goals that official civil rights organizations had been unable to achieve through litigation and protests, and appeals to moral conscience that white institutions seemed capable of ignoring indefinitely. If you want to discover more stories about how Bumpy Johnson forced institutions to change before courts or legislatures recognized the urgency of civil rights enforcement, subscribe to this channel and leave your like. So more people learn that in 1950, a criminal boss accomplished hospital desegregation in Washington Heights 13 years before. Simpkins v. Cone Memorial Hospital established legal precedent, and 16 years before, Medicare certification guidelines forced comprehensive hospital integration nationwide, proving once again that real power often operates outside official channels, and that sometimes the person society labels a criminal is actually enforcing basic human rights that supposedly legitimate institutions refuse to protect. Marcus Williams remained in Columbia Presbyterian's pediatric intensive care unit for 9 days, before being transferred to regular pediatric ward for an additional 5 days of recovery, making a complete physical recovery from pneumonia that would have killed him if treatment had been delayed. Sarah Williams visited every day, taking unpaid time off from her domestic work and accepting financial assistance from Bumpy Johnson to cover both her lost wages and Marcus's hospital bills that totaled approximately $870. Dr. Montgomery did implement the policy changes he had promised, distributing written guidelines to emergency department staff and conducting monthly reviews of admission data. From April 1950 through December 1959, Columbia Presbyterian maintained significantly better record of treating black patients in emergency situations than most other white hospitals in New York City, admitting approximately 240 black patients annually to its emergency and intensive care units compared to fewer than 50 such admissions. Pre-Orto March 1950, reducing preventable deaths among black Harlem residents who previously would have been turned away. Hospital administrators never publicly acknowledged that these changes resulted from pressure applied by a criminal boss who controlled their suppliers and service providers. Never mentioned Bumpy Johnson's name in reports about efforts to improve community relations. Never admitted that a gangster had accomplished desegregation that civil rights lawyers and religious leaders had been demanding for decades without success. And that silence perfectly illustrated the complicated reality of power and justice in mid-20th century America, where the most effective enforcement of basic civil rights sometimes came from people who operated outside law and who used methods that respectable society condemned, but who nonetheless achieved results that legal and political systems failed to produce, despite noble rhetoric about equality and justice. Marcus Williams grew up healthy and successful, graduating from high school in 1961 and attending City College, where he studied engineering before working for 37 years as civil engineer with the New York City Department of Public Works, never knowing that he had been part of a story larger than his individual illness and recovery. Sarah Williams never forgot what Bumpy Johnson had done for her son. Never forgot how he had appeared at the exact moment when hope seemed lost and had transformed an impossible situation into resolved outcome through sheer force of strategic power that nobody had recognized until the moment when it became visible. She attended Bumpy Johnson's funeral when he died in 1968, standing among hundreds of other Harlem residents who came to pay respects to a man whose complicated life defied simple categorization as either criminal or community protector, but who clearly embodied both identities simultaneously. And when people asked Sarah why she was crying so hard at the funeral of a gangster, she told them about March 18, 1950, about her dying son, and the racist hospital and the powerful stranger who forced doctors to provide treatment that saved Marcus's life. About the night when criminal justice proved more effective than legal justice at protecting black people from institutional racism that supposedly respectable society tolerated or ignored, despite claiming to oppose discrimination and support equal access to health care that should have been available to everyone, but that remained systematically denied to people whose skin color marked them as undeserving.